Hello, everybody. I've always enjoyed books comparing and contrasting very different kinds of political characters, ideologies, individuals. One man who's made a career out of that is my guest today, Nicholas Buccola. Some of you will be familiar with his award-winning book, The Fire is Upon Us, which is a book about James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, and the debate over race in America. We did a show actually about Buckley recently with Sam Tannenhouse, who has a 900-page biography of him. And Nick Buccola is back with another compare and contrast, this time Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King, One Man's Freedom. Nick is joining us from Claremont, where he teaches in Southern California at Claremont McKenna College. Nick, do you what is it about these compare and contrast books, Buckley versus Baldwin and Goldwater versus King, that so attracts you as a historian and writer?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me, Andrew. I'm really honored to be here. So the story of me doing these comparative books really started with Buckley and Baldwin. I was invited to write an essay about Baldwin several years ago, and I, was sort of transfixed by the Buckley-Baldwin debate. It just seemed like such a dramatic moment and in history, where these two big personalities who are sort of embodiments of movements are on this international stage at the high tide of the civil rights revolution. And so I was really drawn into that debate as like a really interesting way to at first think about something by way of an essay. And then as I worked on the essay, I kept thinking, there's a book in here. There's a book in here. And I kept saying that to people. And eventually I was like, I guess I'm the one who's going to write this book. And so having that debate, right, gave me the excuse to think about these two movements together. And I found that to be really powerful. I think we often see books that are maybe focused on multiple figures within the same movement, or people who are close to each other and had a really strong personal relationship. But Baldwin and Buckley only met twice, but there's something about the two of them on this kind of collision course over history, and trying to make sense of who they were, how they became who they were that night they clashed in Cambridge in February 1965, that I found to be really powerful. And as I worked on that book, I felt like I was looking at the tip of an iceberg. And one of the things that interests me, my background is in political theory. I teach a class called What is Freedom? And so I was really interested in the centrality of freedom in these two movements. And so one of the ideas I had as I worked on Baldwin and Buckley was, I'm going to write a big book about freedom in these two movements and try to make sense of how the individuals within these movements, leaders, activists, intellectuals, how they understood this idea, and then why it is they viewed each other with such mutual suspicion and hostility. And so I wrote a proposal for that book, and it was, way too broad. And that my editor said something like, I think you have at least two books in here. So this may be the second in a trilogy. And so the idea that we kind of came around to was that volume 2 would be thinking about leaders. And the two leaders that were in my original proposal for that second book were Goldwater and King. And two figures who emphasize the idea of freedom in their ideas and their political thought, and also in their actions, and yet view each other with a great deal of suspicion. So I really find that thinking about these figures together, thinking about these movements together, is extraordinarily powerful, because that space between between these two individuals, between these two movements, is where I think we can find a lot of really important things about history, but also really important things about where we are today. And so I sort of find myself really fascinated by that space between, and also the cross current. So how are individuals in the civil rights movement perceiving those in the conservative movement? How are individuals in the conservative movement perceiving those in the civil rights movement? And so, I found this comparative approach to be really fruitful.
As I said, we had Tannenhouse on the show recently talking about the his Buckley book. It was actually a really interesting interview. He talked a lot about Buckley as an individual, called him a charming gay racist. He had a remarkably attractive and unattractive qualities which seemed to coexist in the same person. And of course, Baldwin himself was a remarkable individual. There's a major new biography coming out about him in the fall, which I hope we'll have the author on. When I first saw your new project, Nick, it occurred to me that, Buckley and Baldwin, whether you like them or not, are equivalents. They're both heavy hitters. They were involved in this very famous debate, as you noted, in 1965, both intellectually at their top of the game. When I thought about MLK and Goldwater, some people might think, well, King is one of the greatest figures in American history, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And of course, what we most remember now Barry Goldwater for in 1964 is getting trounced in the presidential election by Lyndon Johnson. Did it ever concern you that Goldwater and King were different historical figures? One sometimes seen, if not as a joke, certainly as a footnote to later more successful figures like Ronald Reagan, whereas MLK is, of course, the thing in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought about this and confronted this question with both these projects, a kind of, asymmetry in the figures I'm looking at. And I think that, with Goldwater, I see your point, right? There's a way in which Goldwater is somebody who, intellectually is, not on the same level as King. I think that's fair to say. And I think Goldwater himself, by the way, would confess that. I mean, King really loved the life of the mind. He really wanted to be a professor more than anything else. Goldwater was somebody who said, I'm not really into books. And so there's a kind of asymmetry there. But also, as you say, I mean, King is sort of remembered as this hero, one of the most important figures of the era, all the things, the Nobel Peace Prize, go on down the list. And Goldwater is remembered as, kind of one of American politics' greatest losers, right? He gets absolutely obliterated electorally in 1964. But I think there's, so the way I sort of think about that is that that's all true, right? And yet Goldwater is this extraordinarily important figure in the building of the conservative movement. So Jeffrey Tullis and Nicole Mello have this wonderful book about the sort of really important losers in the history of American politics. And Goldwater is right there because Goldwater is somebody who plays this crucial role in building a movement and sort of the consequences of that, of course, are with us today. So although Goldwater himself ends up electorally unsuccessful on the national level, he in many ways sets the stage for Reagan and sort of later revolutions or counter-revolutions on the conservative side of the aisle. So I think that Goldwater is a figure who is important both in terms of sort of the movement he helps build, but also he sort of ends up, and this is where I didn't quite know where this would go when I started the research for the book. I had a kind of sense of Goldwater and what I thought about him and what I thought he was all about. But as I really digged into the archive, went to Tempe and really got into the papers and tried to understand who this guy was and what he had to say over the years, I was sort of one of the questions was, why is it that this figure, this relatively, obscure figure in terms of on the national scene, rising, from the Phoenix, from a businessman in Phoenix to, a Phoenix city councilman to defeating the Senate majority leader in 1952. And as this meteoric rise on as a kind of leader, as the face of conservatism, by the time he's nominated for president, what is the story there? What is it that the sort of the people who found him to be so attractive found appealing? And what was it that he was actually saying about this idea of freedom and all sorts of related ideas? And so I wanted to capture that story. And then I also really wanted to get, again, at that cross current, as Goldwater is rising, as he's getting all sorts of support, from the right, but also really quite fawning media coverage by the mainstream press up until he's nominated for president. Things kind of turn.
Well, that's not the first or the last time there.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things I wanted to get at in this book that I hadn't really seen much about in the literature that exists on Goldwater was how the Black press was covering him and sort of get a sense of like the this sort of alternative, sort of thinking about one's point of view. And so as the Black press, as figures in the Black press are watching Goldwater rise, I was very curious to see how that was being covered. And that was a very, very different story. So yeah, there is a kind of asymmetry here, but there's no question, right? I mean, one of the things the last chapter, the epilogue in the book, I point out that King calls Goldwater the most dangerous man in America, right? So in thinking about the importance of Goldwater, right? Even if there is this asymmetry, the importance of Goldwater as a figure on the American political scene was certainly, something that King believed in. And I try to argue in the book that although there's all sorts of asymmetries here, there's something well worth thinking about these two figures as leaders of competing freedom movements.
Yeah, and your observations about Goldwater really resonate. I've been doing some reading recently on Ayn Rand. We've done some shows on her version of liberalism or libertarianism. Where did Goldwater, I mean, in all your research, where did Goldwater's ideas come from? Of course, he was a counter, I don't know if it's the right word, a countercultural figure, certainly against the consensus in the 50s. Why did he decide that the America of the 50s, this centrist, consensual New Deal America, didn't work, given that the economy was relatively strong and that America was dominating the world in every sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Goldwater, I think his ideas were sort of in part, the personal is always political, right? So there's a sense in which some of what Goldwater came to believe when he's rising on the political scene, even in those early days in Phoenix, his first kind of public writings, just letters to the newspaper and that sort of thing, he makes it very clear that he's hostile to the New Deal, sort of in those early days when there's a kind of a large, consensus in American politics. There seems to be a lot of Republicans who are mostly kind of accepting the New Deal and the legacies of the New Deal. But Goldwater, I think part of it is this kind of sense, the kind of mythology that he associates with his own family as this kind of pioneer family, sort of part of this generation, these generations that are sort of establishing themselves in Arizona. This kind of Jeffersonian individualism is one of the things that Goldwater would often talk about in terms of the kind of roots of his political beliefs. And so that kind of stays with him. And then his family has this department store, the Goldwater department store in Arizona.
And it's worth noting, of course, that he's certainly the closest thing America's ever had to a Jewish president.
That's true, right? And so Goldwater's father, his father's side of the family is Jewish, and there's a kind of, I think that kind of factors into the story. It's kind of an unstated thing, throughout Goldwater's career, and that Goldwater is growing up with this Jewish surname. His family his father. He says, "My father never taught me anything about what it might mean to be Jewish," so he didn't really identify strongly with that part of his heritage, but he did grow up with this surname, and obviously this overwhelmingly, Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And so that, I think, always factors into some of the ways in which he views the world, and sort of actually kind of feeds his strong sense of individualism in certain ways. But yeah, Goldwater is somebody who kind of has this kind of mythology of this sort of pioneer spirit that's central to his ideas. And then he is somebody, although not a deep reader, who starts to then take some of that kind of personal philosophy, and his family sort of being this having this kind of business, the small business empire in Arizona, I think feeds into this as well. And he sort of begins to, see some of these ideas. And, you mentioned Ayn Rand. I mean, some of these ideas that sort of are out there on the philosophical, political scene. He's reading some conservative magazines and newspapers as those begin to rise in prominence. And he sort of sees himself fitting pretty cleanly into a particular point of view, and runs, as a Republican in a Democratic state. Again, the Senate Majority Leader is the senator that he ends up defeating in 1952. So Goldwater kind of, begins to sort of try to figure out, as he enters into politics in a serious way, first on the Phoenix City Council, and then eventually with this dark horse run for Senate, that he's sort of like finding his way on the American right and trying to figure out where he fits. And that's part of the story here, is that he sort of has this kind of hostility to the New Deal, this kind of generally like pioneer libertarianism, but then also has to sort of situate himself on this, on these questions of civil rights that are becoming more and more prominent at that phase in the mid 1950s when King arrives on the scene.
Yeah, maybe in a way, Goldwater, although he's not a great hero on the left, might be a model for the Democrats in 2025 trying to reinvent themselves. So let's get to MLK. You've written considerably on the African American tradition. You not just wrote "The Fire Is Upon Us," which was partly about James Baldwin. You've also written extensively on the political thought of Frederick Douglass, and also on Abraham Lincoln. So you're all too familiar with this. How important is? I mean, you've presented, and maybe I'm putting words into your life, into your mouth. You've presented Goldwater as perhaps not an accidental figure in history, but someone who somehow stumbled into the scene or onto the scene and was able to cobble together ideas, a movement which defined him. What's your reading of MLK? I mean, of course, he's acquired almost a religious quality in some communities in America these days, and he was himself a religious figure. How original a thinker was he? I mean, in some of the narratives and interviews I've done on him, he's presented as someone who, in a similar way to Goldwater, even if he's from a much more distinguished family in terms of politics in America, he himself also somehow stumbled onto the scene.
Yeah. King, I mean, it's fascinating to, one of these things with taking on a project, which King figures prominently, that's tricky is, in terms of number of books written about people is probably like, Jesus, Abraham Lincoln, then Martin Luther King. So I came into this, project with a sense of King as his biography, of assigning his writings and some of the classes that I teach. And he comes up, of course, as a important figure in the Baldwin Buckley story that I told in The Fires Upon Us. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of the sort of accidental, rise of Martin Luther King that is another parallel here. I start the book, the kind of proper narrative of the book in December 1955, when King is sort of appears, on the national scene by way of the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's a fascinating story that's been covered well in so many of the King biographies. But King's 26 years old. He's really, an intellectual, right? He's somebody who cares deeply about theology. He's somebody who studied theology in a serious way. So he has all these ideas, kicking around in his head about the social gospel, about making Christian, sort of thinking about the social and political consequences of Christian doctrine, Reinhold Niebuhr, and neo-orthodoxy and liberal theology, all these things that are kind of things he's been thinking about for years. And he's in Montgomery, and he hasn't been there for very long. And this bus boycott, begins. And, so King's not, a central figure in initiating that bus boycott, but he's sort of thrust into this position of leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association. I mean, really, the bus boycott is really a story of rebellious women, is one of the things that other historians have covered so well. And I try to, center in the book is that the initiation of that is really about this group of rebellious women. But King finds himself in this position where in this cold night in December of 1955, he's there in front of this, packed Holt Street Baptist Church, now as a kind of spokesperson for this movement. And so it's a moment where the sort of preparation meeting the moment, kind of thing, where King then goes into that role as somebody who really thinks deeply about these questions of what does it mean to bring this Christian doctrine into the public sphere, and what does it mean to pursue a kind of social justice that's rooted in this theology and rooted in this philosophy he'd been studying for years. And so that story of King's rise is a really fascinating one, where he is, for somebody like me who sort of, has a background in political theory and is doing this kind of intellectual history. King is very, is really trying to engage, right? He's engaging in political action, and he becomes more and more political over the course of the narrative.
Well, in that sense, I mean, MLK remains an incredibly divisive figure. He was then, he remains today. Some of the criticism I've read is of him as a very smart man, but also a little bit of an opportunist, is that he jumped on this opportunity. What's your reading of that?
Yeah, I mean, I find that, King, one of the things that I find really powerful about the ways in which King navigates that question is that, there's certainly been plenty of criticism, from, King's own time, right? Of like when he appears on the cover of Time magazine, for example, a lot of people in the movement who'd been engaged in the work in the Montgomery bus boycott much longer than him, there was a little bit of heat that he got because of that. Like, here's King on the cover of Time magazine, and we've been building this for so long, and he's just arrived on the scene.
And of course, he was from a very privileged Black family.
Right. And so yeah, and King, so like we were thinking about the people who are actually in the position of suffering the degradation of the Montgomery bus system. It was not King, right? King had a car, right? King was not, and so he recognizes this distance between himself in terms of his life experience and this role that he's playing. But he also, one of the things I found interesting just as in terms of his political thinking, is I do think that the questions of opportunism and all those sorts of things, I'll let the real biographers sort those out. But I think what King tries to do intellectually is tries to think about the relationship between his role as a leader and what he sees as the spirit and the soul of this movement. And so one of my favorite moments to capture this is when King's on trial as a conspirator in the Montgomery bus boycott. There's this wonderful moment when the lawyer is cross-examining him, and he says, he basically says, who formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association? And King says, well, thousands of people formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And the lawyer says, what do you mean thousands of people? Thousands of people didn't get into a room and come up, write this list of demands. And then King says, it depends on what you mean by formulate. And I think what King was getting at is, and what he would explain in other contexts, was that he was trying to capture the radically democratic nature of this movement, that this movement, the roots of this movement, the formulation of the demands of this movement came from the people themselves and the experience of the people themselves. So King always said, if I wasn't here, if I, if you didn't have Martin Luther King here to play this role, this movement is still happening, and this message is hopefully getting across. But King found himself in this role as somebody who was such a gifted orator and such a gifted, intellectual, who's sort of at this intersection of thinking and politics. He found himself in this role where he was going to try to bear witness to what he was seeing, and he was trying to play this role of explaining as best he could what he thought was the soul of the movement. And so I think that's where I think King, insofar as he did see it, there was an opportunity for him, I guess, personally, but it was an opportunity he seemed reluctant in all sorts of ways to embrace, and often wanted to just step out of it and long for the day when he could be out of the center of the action. But he never gets out of the center of the action. Of course, we know that from December 55 till the end of his life in April 1968. But I think so what he tries to do, in his best moments, is tries to say, how can I capture with my voice the spirit of this movement? And so that's kind of the way I read King in this book.
Yeah, in a way, the way you're presenting it brings to mind Bobby Kennedy's 1966 speech on ripples of hope about history can be made by many people. So to remind ourselves, Nick, of the subtitle of the book, Goldwater, King and the Struggle Over an American Ideal. The book is called One Man's Freedom. So that ideal is freedom, or at least one man's freedom. You noted that you're a political theorist rather than a biographer. What do you mean by freedom, and how did they disagree? I mean, the obvious, for anyone who knows even the slightest thing about certainly Goldwater, freedom is economic freedom, whereas I'm guessing MLK's freedom is primarily political. But you've done a lot of thinking on this. So what's the foundational difference between King and Goldwater's notion of freedom?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the question, at the heart of the book. And I think one of the things that I have been thinking about as I, prepare to go out on the road and talk about the book is that both King and Goldwater, very early in the narrative of this, that I tell in the book, both of them talk about or sort of discuss the idea of seeking a true liberalism or an authentic liberalism. And liberalism, understood here very broadly, just as we think about the root of the word liberalism, and it's in the sort of liberty at the center of liberalism being a political doctrine that's concerned with securing freedom for people, securing liberty for people, using those synonymously for a moment. And so, King says, in the mid 50s, when he's making an important speech in Washington, D.C., he says, I would love to find a liberalism that was really liberal, that actually delivered on this promise of securing freedom for people. And Goldwater, at the same time, is giving speeches at places like the Citadel in South Carolina, and he's talking about, I refuse to call the contemporary American left liberal because that's an insult to the term liberalism. I'm looking, they're faux liberals. I'm looking for a real liberalism that actually secures freedom. So they're both kind of circling around this idea of we want to find a political doctrine that secures the sort of conditions morally, socially, economically that actually, provides freedom for people. And yet they have this really dramatic, difference in what that looks like. So as you mentioned, there's a sense in which part of the story is sort of like the obvious part of the story is the the sense in which Goldwater seems to embody this kind of libertarian sense of freedom, that so proper freedom is freedom from interference. And for Goldwater, the two biggest threats to our freedom are big government, and I put that in quotes, and big labor, right? So he rises in the 50s. He becomes the central figure in the conservative movement, really is because of his hostility to big labor, and big government, and sort of the relationship between those two things. And so he's trying to make this case that we are going to be free as individuals insofar as we can keep those threats at bay and allow people to sort of pursue their economic freedom without interference from those sources. King, on the other hand, I think it gives us a kind of more of a freedom, a sort of a positive conception of freedom. So if Goldwater's is what we associate with this idea of negative freedom, King is going to sort of frame freedom in a positive way and think about freedom as empowerment. So the importance of non-interference is not lost on King, right? King can see all sorts of ways in which the threat of coercion from the state and from private actors has been a major issue, of course, for African Americans throughout history, right? So he's not asleep to the sort of importance of non-interference. But one of the questions he has for Goldwater is to say, is it really the case that quote unquote big government, so for Goldwater, that's going to be the federal government in particular, is it the case, King asked Goldwater, that the federal government is always a threat to your freedom? And so he asks, Goldwater in this very direct way, right, to say that if you are an African American in Alabama, your freedom in that non-interference sense is being threatened all the time by local government, by state government, and by private individuals. So, he says that the sort of active federal government is sometimes necessary to vindicate people's negative freedom. And then on the sort of positive freedom, this idea of freedom as empowerment, King is there to ask this other question, which is to say, can we really say that, let's imagine that actually people's negative freedom is being respected. Can we really say that an individual is free if they are almost completely disempowered economically and socially, if they're not free to move about the spaces in their society freely, sort of thinking about social freedom and what that might mean? Or are we really able to say that someone is free if they are dominated economically by conditions in which the color of their skin, and among other factors, is keeping them in a position of economic weakness?
Let me ask about both. Goldwater, of course, is most associated with thinking about economic freedom, capitalism, and hostility to the New Deal and big government, big labor. Was he able to think outside economics? And the same for MLK. Of course, he's remarkably important figure in civil rights in the African American community. But was MLK ever able to escape his own skin, the issue of race? Was he able to think beyond or before race when it comes to freedom?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really important part of the book, and a really important question. The answer is yes to both of those things. And so I think that
both of them, they were both able to escape their own conceptual stereotyping, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things about this book is that, race is central, right, to what I'm doing in this book, but it's not the whole story. And I think your question really gets at it in a direct way. So for Goldwater, I mean, a lot of these speeches about, free enterprise and economic liberty and so on, at first glance, we know that story, right? We know kind of what that argument looks like. But what I found in the book is that Goldwater is, as he's rising on the scene in the early 50s, right? So he's elected to the Senate in 1952. He gets to Washington, and he really has no interest really in legislating or building coalitions. Almost, immediately they make him chair of the Senate campaign committee, sending him out on the road to preach his gospel of freedom. And so he's traveling all the time. And this runs through the sort of narrative of the book, is Goldwater is always on the road talking about his ideas. And of course, that economic message is there. But what I found is that he's really a culture warrior. This is about a kind of idea of freedom, and he'll use kind of spiritual language and often talk about freedom in this way that is about masculinity and about sort of self-reliance, and it's about like this sort of idea that we have to fight a culture war to defend a particular understanding of freedom that, yes, has economic consequences for sure, and that's always central to the message. But he's he's concerned with things far beyond that. And again, of course, where this spills into the questions of race is central to the story, but not the whole of it.
And just one question on Goldwater. Was he relatively indifferent to McCarthyism? Was he involved with Joe McCarthy at all?
Yeah. So so one of the things that Goldwater is a staunch defender of McCarthy, right? So this is when I said like big government earlier, and put that in quotations, of course, we're seeing in the news every day just how deeply, and note the sarcasm of a voice, just how deeply the conservative movement is committed to limited government. But so Goldwater is defending McCarthy. He is there to defend McCarthy from, the beginning of his Senate career to when McCarthy dies. Goldwater gives a speech on the Senate floor talking about how lucky America, we were as a country to have Joe McCarthy to stand up for these ideas when others were not willing to. So yeah, Goldwater he's definitely a hawkish cold warrior in every sense of the word. And so that's definitely part of this story. So I do try to, bring that in to the story. That's another point of contrast with King for sure. And then this, and of course, the ways in which Goldwater, is sort of gets to the Senate and is immediately cozying up to people like, the arch segregationist Strom Thurmond. So as we think about, okay, what does it mean to be this kind of quote unquote libertarian on the one hand, and yet be willing to sort of cozy up to these really hardcore segregationists who are clearly, at least in some of their politics, not deeply libertarian. And so that's one of the ways in which I try to get at the senses in which Goldwater's, economic philosophy has all these sort of implications beyond the sort of question before him. And then on your question about King, I mean, this is another central piece of the story. And I think actually one of the ways in which one of the reasons King identifies Goldwater as the most dangerous man in America, of course, it has something to do with race and Goldwater's vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But actually getting into these documents and examining what King had to say about Goldwater, King actually said what's central. One of the things that's central to his critique of Goldwater is on this question of economic freedom properly understood. So when King is sort of at the center, of the sort of the climactic moment in the book in 1964, when they're sort of on this collision course and they're sort of colliding in the election of 1964, at least indirectly, right? Never engaging each other in the same room, but engaging each other through the press and so on. King identifies Goldwater's economic philosophy as even almost as threatening as his philosophy on civil rights. And so King at the time is promoting an economic Bill of Rights. He is promoting a massive federal program, a series of federal programs that will address the history of economic inequality in this country across racial lines. So when King introduces the Economic Bill of Rights, he says, yes, this program, because of the history, the intersection of racial exploitation and economic exploitation in this history, this series of programs will have a major impact on the African American community. But he points out again and again that the history of economic exploitation goes across racial lines, and the impact of these programs will cut across racial lines. So in terms of your question of King, the centrality of civil rights is there for King, but I think King's philosophy of freedom is capacious and it applies in all sorts of different ways beyond questions of civil rights.
Coming back to Goldwater, you noted that his libertarianism resulted in doing deals with Strom Thurmond, a segregationist. Are you suggesting that one can't be an economic libertarian in America without being, if not a segregationist, certainly someone who's illiberal on race? Is it possible to be a libertarian, do you think, Nick, and be neutral on race, shall we say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I think that I think I have two answers to it, right? I mean, and there's definitely a lot of great work that kind of looks at this question and tries to think through historically ways in which something like a kind of sort of tries to define what libertarianism is, and then tries to make sense of how do we draw these lines between public and private in ways that actually vindicate people's freedom, and is there a case to be made for like we can be committed to a kind of libertarian point of view and still have room in our philosophy for interventions into the social and economic sphere in order to actually make people free in a meaningful sense. So I would say that the philosophical possibility is there on the one hand, and yet I think the sort of, like, I would say the what cuts in the other way for me at least is that question of if our philosophy, and I take Goldwater to be very sincere on these questions. I don't argue in the book that he harbored, secret racist views, and he's using this philosophy as a way to sort of reach particular conclusions. I actually take him to be sincere. Like, I think he believes what he's saying. But I think one of the questions then becomes, if so for Goldwater, on the question of this public and private, he says he votes for a couple of civil rights bills while he's in Congress, the 57 Act and the 60 Act. He has all these sort of personal views on race that seem to be quite progressive, for especially compared to a lot of the other folks who are in his coalition. And yet, he votes against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because he's worried about interventions into the private sphere, in particular, the public accommodations section of the bill, and the section of the bill dealing with employment discrimination. And so one of the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves is, there's plenty of libertarians to today, right, that still defend that view. That there's,
and we've had a number of them on the show.
Yeah, exactly. So again, so we can have this discussion of, like, if this is where your philosophy leads you, and again, not question, just for a moment, I won't question the sincerity, right, of Goldwater actually believing that and having these economic objections and constitutional objections. Then I think what King says to us is, like, this presents us with a series of questions about our political philosophy and our constitutional theory. If that is the conclusion that you've reached, then I think we have a problem, right? Because King is there to say to us, at playing this role as the kind of conscience of the country. And there's this moment. I'll just use a story by way to sort of explain this. There's this moment, right about the same moment, the same day, when Goldwater is on the floor of the Senate justifying his decision to vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. King is standing in the doorway, of this motor lodge in St. Augustine, Florida, this deeply segregated place. And he's standing there, as part of a direct action campaign to try to challenge the segregation in that town, and the sort of the basic right of people to enter into a place of business, like the weary traveler trying to lay their head down at night. King is there with a group of protesters trying to challenge the idea that can we say this is a free society? Can we say this is a just society if we have a place like this that does not allow people to enter their place of business, to eat or to rest? And so King is there to sort of raise this question, right as Goldwater is saying the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 is a threat to freedom in this fundamental way. So what I try to do in the book is say, look, this is the choice, right? This is what they're giving us, their best case for each of these views of freedom. And so what is it that we think, as we think about what it means to be free in our society, both like as we look back at this history, but also think about what it means today? What is it that we conclude about our own responsibilities to help realize freedom in this moment?
So as I said, you pretty much end the book with King's winning of the Nobel Peace Prize in '64 and Goldwater's defeat by LBJ. Would it be fair to say, Nick, in a way, that at the end of the two men's lives, we remember King because of the storm that took place really after his death, the splitting, I think, of the Black community, the emergence of a much more radical, I guess, left-wing, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, and of course, Reagan's masterly political reinvention of Goldwater's libertarianism into a much more marketable and ultimately successful takeover of the Republican Party. So in a way, King is the end of his story of the idea of freedom, whereas Buckley is the beginning of his. Or is that an oversimplistic way of looking at it?
I think that's an important part of this, right? Is that, and this is something I didn't quite know, is how this book would end, or where it would end with Buckley versus Baldwin. I had this climactic debate that they had in 1965, and I had this.
You could have imagined the debate. You could have done it in AI.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so with Goldwater King, I originally envisioned a book that would take us through to '68 and the end of King's life. But I was supposed to write a book of 100,000 words. I was already at about 175,000 words as I got into 1964. So as my editor likes to say, there are limits to bindery technology, right? There's books can only be so big.
I don't think I want to be your editor, Nick.
Yeah.
You give these guys a lot of grief.
I'm verbalicious is what I like to say. But anyway, I'm working on a short book right now that I'm going to meet my word count. But anyway, so I think part of what I wanted to do, and it was pretty clear to me as I got into it, that there was the asymmetries. Some of the asymmetries got a little bit too profound after 64, and Goldwater's out of office for a few years. King, is taking his movement in some different directions, and it's kind of a new phase in American political development. So it was just sort of like, it really is like the basis for another book in some ways. But yeah, I think that part of the story though is, as we look at this moment, right, when the two of them are sort of like the clash, so to speak, really occurs in 64 with Goldwater's nomination, and King, who is very reluctant, throughout his career to endorse political candidates or to speak directly about political in opposition to political candidates, he makes an exception for Goldwater. And so that moment in 64, they really are at odds, right? And there's this dramatic moment in July of 64 when King is there at the Republican convention. He would go to the Republican and Democratic conventions and deliver speeches to the platform committees. And so he's there in 64, just days before Goldwater.
And it is worth, I mean, again, way more than this about this than I do, but it is worth noting that in 64, the Republican Party was still seen by some Black Americans as the party of Lincoln. I remember all the stories about Jackie Robinson and his initial sympathy with Richard Nixon. So this was before the Southern strategy. It was before 68. So shall we say, the color line between the two parties was much less self-evident in 64 than it is in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another really important part of this story is, and again, you mentioned the sort of legacies question and where the party goes after this, and it's related to this, is that moment in 64 is such a pivotal moment for the history of the Republican Party and the history of the conservative movement, because you have at that convention in 64, the two issues that are tearing the party apart are race and extremism. These are the two central kind of points of debate at that convention. And so you have, and one of the moments that I found to be just extraordinarily powerful, and it's one of my favorite images in the book. I love the sort of visuals. I try to get as many visuals into my books as I can. Is this moment when this this lifelong Republican, George Parker, this African-American Republican who, like you said, thinks of the Republican Party, right, as the party of Lincoln. Like, that is what it is to him. It's been to generations of his family. There's this really dramatic moment when he's standing there in the convention hall before the platform committee. And there's an image, a famous image of him where he's standing before Goldwater has just delivered a short, series of comments to the platform committee. And again, race and extremism are the two central issues that they're really arguing about. And Parker stands up and Goldwater takes some questions, and he calls on Parker. And there's this image of Parker standing just surrounded by this sea of white faces. And he says to Goldwater directly, the platform committee had agreed to add a plank that would say they pledged, if Goldwater was elected, that he would pledge to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this act that he had just voted against. And so Goldwater said, I lost, and so now it's my obligation, if I'm elected president, to enforce this law. But Parker says that's not enough for him. He says, I want to hear from you, Senator, how you will use the moral power of the presidency to promote this law, to support this law, to help tell the country that this is the right thing to do. And Goldwater says, well, I'm telling you right now, I'll do that. I'm giving you my word. And Parker's just not willing. He says he wants to hear more. He wants Goldwater to really convince him that this is something he's willing to do. And Goldwater tries, and they kind of go back and forth. But there's a way and Parker ends up, leaving the convention along with several others, dissatisfied, right? Unwilling to support Goldwater. And so there's something about that moment, right, in which Goldwater is willing to, in his speech, right, he gives this line about extremism and defense of liberty, sort of sides with the quote unquote extremists, the far right of the time. It was a central issue in the in the party and in the convention at the time. And he also is just sort of unwilling, really, in that speech, his convention speech, unwilling to say anything of substance about civil rights. Throughout the campaign, he said, he basically pledges, he makes an agreement with Lyndon Johnson to not exploit racial tensions for the sake of political gain.
And there were, of course, this was a time of enormous racial unrest just before what? Many riots in American cities, racial riots of one kind or another.
Right. And so, but that idea of not exploiting racial tensions for the sake of political gain, that's something that I think, people can agree with that as a general principle. But Goldwater extends that. And this is something this is one of the stories of the book is Goldwater's silence. Is like, there's so many moments throughout the story that I tell in this book when Goldwater, he has, the Senate floor, he has he's on the road speaking practically every week. He's got a syndicated newspaper column. He's got all these different opportunities to weigh in on how his philosophy of freedom applies to these civil rights issues. And again, he's silent. And so throughout the campaign, he's basically not just, so to say we're not going to exploit racial tensions for political gain is one thing, but then Goldwater extends that to basically staying mostly silent about these issues. But when they do come up, and this is something I try to bring through in the book as clearly as I can, when they do come up, when Goldwater is willing to talk about race, he does it in this way that's, it's much more subtle than somebody like, George Wallace or some of these segregationists.
Or even Nixon.
Yeah. But he's definitely, I think, without trying to exploit the issue, he's definitely conflating a lot of things and not saying a lot of things that he could be saying that I think could have been extraordinarily beneficial in terms of the history of conservatism and the history of the Republican Party, right? Goldwater would often say, like, I'm against segregation morally, but I have this constitutional obligation to this or that. He had plenty of opportunities to really deliver that message strongly to not only Southern audiences, but audiences around the country, and he did not do so. So there's a kind of failure on Goldwater's part to use the platform, precisely the platform that Parker is asking him that, if he will use during the Republican convention. Parker was proven right, I think, by the campaign in '64, that Goldwater was not prepared to use whatever moral power he had to defend the legitimacy and the justice of equality.
Yeah, and I think your conclusion might not surprise a lot of progressives. Finally, Nick, in 2025, are we beyond the Goldwater King moment and this struggle over an American ideal? We have a current administration that seems certainly post-libertarian, if not outrightly hostile to libertarianism. Strong state, strong president. On the other hand, they're also very liberal on identity and race. What does your book, this new book, One Man's Freedom, tell us about the America of 2025?
Well, I think we're definitely not beyond this moment. There's a way in which the things that I was writing about in the book, I probably handed the book in before the election of Trump in November 2024, and so as Trump came in, and there was this sort of the rise of this, Doge and Elon Musk and all these things. Some of the things I talk about in the book in terms of King's message on these economic questions, for example, became all the more relevant, right? If you think about the ways the selective kind of quote unquote libertarianism of the Trump administration, in many ways bring to the fore just how relevant this debate was, just how deeply at odds the philosophy that we see governing the American right today is with the message of Martin Luther King, right? And so there's a sense in which, and so you take the economic questions, right? When King is there to say, can we really say that individuals are free if they are disempowered economically in the private sphere, if there's ways in which the state is fundamentally working against the economic interests of such a vast majority of this country? The King is there to say that this is unacceptable. And in fact, it's not unacceptable just in terms of this question of equality, an important idea also in the American political tradition, but it's unacceptable as a matter of freedom. I think that's central, but also on the question of race, right, which is also central to this story. What we're seeing right now in terms of the contemporary American right and the philosophy of race. I think there's ways in which this story is actually in a lot of ways maybe even more relevant than the Buckley Baldwin story, because Goldwater is this interesting character on when it comes to questions of race. There's all these moments in the book where it's very clear that Goldwater, you know, he might have some good instincts in terms of how he interacts with people, you know, and so on racial terms and in his private life. But in terms of how that translates into politics, there's all sorts of moments in the story that are, I think, reveal this kind of unwillingness to face up to the realities that are happening around him. And so I think that part of our politics is central, right? There aren't many people today who call themselves racists in an open way. There's plenty out there on the American right now, but it's not something that's sort of widespread. But it's this other kind of racism, this kind of racism where it's an unwillingness to come to terms with history. We're certainly seeing that as a central part of this moment, right? If you watch, you know, for example, this person they put in charge of reviewing the Smithsonian, right? This idea of like this completely, I mean, I invite, you know, the listeners to just listen to this person they put in charge of reviewing the Smithsonian. It is this kind of deeply ignorant approach to the history of racism in this country that is in many ways, even though it's not admitting to being racist in any kind of nefarious way or sort of hostile way, it has the same consequences. So I think there's a way in which
it's what you're not saying what you are rather than what you are saying. Exactly as you note, or at least I won't say you accuse, but you describe Goldwater's treatment of the Civil Rights Act. So as William Faulkner, who himself knew a thing or two about American race, famously said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. I think Nicholas Buccola's new book, One Man's Freedom, Goldwater King and the Struggle Over an American Ideal, it's out in a couple of days. When's it out, Nick?
It comes out Tuesday, October 7th. So I always recommend
just a few days. Congratulations on the book, Nick. And we're looking forward to the third in the trilogy. What's the third book going to be about?
That's to be announced. But yeah, my students and I at Claremont McKenna College we spent the summer reading a lot of primary sources, kind of thinking about.
Don't blame your students. You got to choose it yourself.
Yeah, well, they're helping me work through the primary sources to figure out just how to frame it. But I'm really interested in this question of how, you know, different activists in the two movements understood what they understood themselves to be doing, and then how they were perceived by their opposite, you know. And so that's kind of what we're circling around. So yeah, hopefully stay tuned for volume 3 in the trilogy.
Well, I hope it won't be too long, Nick. Honored to have you on the show. Fascinating new book, One Man's Freedom, and we'll get you back on when the third book comes out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.